Welcome everybody to the Be Better Club. Today is October 12th and we're talking online learning choice and equity, which is a topic suggested by Lakeland, who is here with us but may be frozen right now. We're waiting to see if she's still around. But this is an important topic because, I mean, in general, but I think in particular because of the pandemic, thinking about the ways that we engage each other and what that looks like in online learning environments is really important. I shared with you as part of the schedule a podcast that Stommel and colleagues had did in the Teaching in Higher Ed blog, which was a really interesting piece about how to be together online. And the interviewee seemed to be pretty pro being together online. Like we weren't losing that much in that sort of engagement. And I know Lakeland, you just got out of another session and so did I, but I wonder if you wanted to start us off with some of your thoughts about the topic and we can go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So hello, everybody. This was, as Dr. Beaver put in the email out to everybody, an idea that I had thought about not presenting, but discussing in the Be Better Club, because it's a topic that has come up continuously in my circles and at conferences and things like that, where communication scholars are discussing this idea of the fairness and the ethical philosophy behind, like, do we tell people to turn on their cameras or not? Because, I've had a lot of professors be, as we're talking about this idea of answering that question, who were like, oh, they have to turn them on because that's how they learn the best. And that's how, they can't learn, they don't have the cameras on, and just all of these different kinds of arguments that to me don't really hold water under the lamplight of, okay, well, even if that were true, just because we can doesn't mean we should, right? Just because that might be the best way that they learn doesn't mean that should outweigh if it's fair to ask a student who might not be in an optimal learning environment anyway, to turn on their camera for the whole world to then see that same issue, or perceived issue from the student. So, and I have a lot of hot takes on this that I don't want to open up with. So, but that is kind of where the inspiration came from on my end. But yeah, if y'all have any questions about any of that kind of whatever I just said, let me know.
Yeah, I'd love to hear how everything's been for you all, because we've all been through this at least in the last year and a half, right? Working remotely, working from home, with pets and families and internet trouble and all sorts of factors that go into the new ways we engage one another.
Well, my circumstance had nothing to do with COVID, actually. I think you as professors got better at it because you were forced to present to a wider audience. Mine's always been online, and I'm online now with Western Michigan University, and I struggle with the technology. I was in the middle of a class that's asynchronous learning. So we only have 6 meetings, about 2.5 hours, 6 meetings a whole semester. And my internet went out about a half hour in, and we were supposed to break off in groups and work with people. I found myself at the Spectrum store refraining from choking the salesperson, which I know they weren't responsible for, but I was like, this is so important. Well, we'll give you a refund on the day. I said, money's not the, are you going to refund my tuition if I flunk this class because your internet is crashing? I was just so frustrated, and I struggle with the technology anyway, uploading Excel into some of these platforms that we have to do. I actually, within the last 24 hours, struggled with that. I'd like to get back in the classroom, actually, personally. So.
Yeah, I hear you, Sterling. And as a professor, I feel the same way. There are ways in which, especially when I started, it wasn't during the pandemic either, but when I started teaching online, I was like, oh, I'd much rather do this in the classroom. I miss seeing people. But I kind of came to the realization, maybe like the interviewee from the podcast, where like I started to feel like I was connecting, say, to you all in the same ways that I would in the classroom. It's just that there's this mediation going on. And there's all kinds of, Shelley, you know this literature well from TNT, but there's all kinds of, and your own work, but there's all kinds of literature around the nature of mediation, technological mediation, and the remediation that goes on in our communication strategies. Is that does anybody else share Sterling's frustrations, or has it been an easy transition?
I would say it's a little different for me. I think in the beginning, it was a little bit difficult. And then as the time went on, I think some of the bonds that I had either not before, actually, I either formed bonds while being remote and closer ones, which I thought was weird. I think with what Lakeland was saying, that feeling of like having to have your camera on though is something that I struggle with a lot because I'm more of a shy person. So I used to only want to take online classes for that reason, to not have to be as engaged or as present. That's probably the wrong word to use, but then there's moments where you do want to have the camera on and you feel comfortable, or if it's smaller groups. So it was something kind of in my work environment, it was pretty forced. Like the only way you're being seen as checked in is having your camera on, and they expect that. And if you didn't, it'd be an issue. And I think as time has gone on, people realize that you don't necessarily have to have it on to be as engaged, or you don't have to have it on to be seen as doing your work. And so I think that that's been backed. People have been backed off of that need, and I think that that's actually formed better relationships and me wanting to maybe be more present in some of those interactions than before. Sorry, I kind of bounced around there.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
No, that's good. And I'm in a similar boat, Camille, I think. I mean, we were instructed as instructors and faculty to sort of make sure that we recognized those differences in needs and made sure that students weren't required. The best practice that we've been given by the university is make sure your students aren't required to have your cameras on. And that's not just because of questions of autonomy, like wanting to let students choose, but it's also questions of harms, because sometimes like students are taking classes from their car in front of the local Panera, or they're taking it, in their parents' kitchen because they don't have a bedroom, or like there's all kinds of questions that may lead to harm if the visual is required. And so there's that like privacy aspect too, where by turning your camera on, you're letting people into your life. So I used to do, when we first started this, I used to just do this, right? And you saw into my life. And so all of the questions became about like the instruments behind me, or like, the dehumidifier on the floor or whatever. And people had this access into my world that they didn't. And then like little by little, I started doing this. And so then it was just me, and it didn't matter where I was. And that feels disingenuous to me. Like I could be like, I'm on campus, and you'd never really know unless my cat jumps in front of the camera, right? So I think the ethical implications range that gamut. And one lens through which to do this kind of thinking would be that sort of bioethics principlist lens that we often use, thinking about questions of autonomy and choice, justice, which might be access questions, and then the harms and benefits lens is about, the benefits might be adaptability to different learning styles, but the harms might be, people who might need those visual cues or be more prone to learning in person, or might be easily distractible at home because of the differences, either environmentally or digitally. So I think that lens is really instructive too. And I don't know, I mean, this is why like when I was interested in the topic, because no matter what lens you apply, it seems like it's a gray area. There seems like there's costs and benefits. And to watch the university negotiate this has been really interesting. A lot of us had been teaching in this way, which is now called V mode, for a long time, like since the beginning of the pandemic or before. We've been doing sessions like this or formal classes synchronously online. But only as of this fall does the university have a formal designation and a training for V mode. So it's like the university has sort of said, okay, right, the benefits outweigh the harms, and so we're going to like institutionalize this. So the thing we're doing right now is technically called V mode. which is weird because it's like, who cares? It's sort of interacting in the same way. And from, again, I don't know, maybe it's just my limited perspective, but my students have seemed to really like the flexibility. And I will say from an instructor's perspective, to not have students sitting in a class with me is a little weird from a control point of view, because a lot of times my students will be like on the floor in their bedroom, or they'll have their camera off making dinner, or they'll be like, and that's fine with me, but I do recognize that distractions weed their way in. And I don't know, I haven't done this long enough or in an intentional way to measure if there are like learning differences, like if students take up material differently in an online mode. Shelley, you've had me for classes now, like, what do you think here?
So I had the perspective, I've been both on the instructor side and on the student side in the virtual mode. And it is different depending on the side I'm on. So the instructor side of me likes to see faces so that I can have a better dialogue, but my classes are 60 undergraduates. When I'm in most of our class time is spent in active learning environments, working in teams. So I'm talking to them for about 15 minutes and then sending them to breakout rooms. During that 15 minutes, I'm giving introductions. I can't watch 60 people at the same time. It doesn't matter. It's nice to see a couple of people to know that, yes, they're hearing me and my internet hasn't cut off, but there is no way I can replicate that classroom environment to be able to look around at everybody during that 15-minute time period anyhow. But it makes a big difference once I send them out into their teams. And as I jump through breakout rooms to talk them through, check on them, see how they're doing, see where they need some guidance. The teams that are working better together are the ones that have their cameras on. The teams that don't, I see that immediately, I sense that it's quieter. And over the course of the semester, I can see the difference in work product. And as a whole, speaking in generalities, the teams that keep their cameras on throughout the semester produce better work over the course of the semester. So there is some level of engagement to that. Now, at the same time, I felt those same issues, though, in trying to arm twist them to keep their cameras on. They didn't choose to take class from their bedrooms, from their parents' kitchens. And yes, I've had students from their cars. I've had a student at her place of employment sitting there in her uniform before her shift began. They weren't given a choice. It was, if you want to take this class is in B mode. And we are forcing them to bring their personal life in. And I can say, sitting on the student side as well, because my classes I take are at night, there is no way for me to keep my personal life out of it. I share a house with a husband and 3 teenagers and a dog. There is absolutely no way at 6 o'clock at night I can shut the door to my office and never see them. It is impossible. And then it becomes a balancing of how much of what is going on is a distraction to everybody else. How many times do I keep looking away and having a side conversation? How many times am I telling the dog to be quiet? How many times am I answering the question, I have no idea what's for dinner, go look in the refrigerator and find something. And so my balance is different because I control the environment when I teach. I'm very good, make sure nobody comes in, it's my schedule. I make sure the dog's the dog sitter. I don't have that flexibility when I take a class. And so I'm sensing from the student side, it's a different, I feel it just in my changing hats. So I can only imagine our students, especially my undergrads, who have much less control over their lives and what they bring in to the classroom when it's in a virtual environment. So there is that ethical question about how much am I forcing them to share? How much do I want to force them to share? I have pretty generic Bed Bath & Beyond print on the back wall. That's not really anything, but other people can't make that decision. My worst thing is lighting. My office has 3 windows. There is no way I can get good lighting in here. But that's not the biggest problem my students have. My students have much bigger questions about how to present themselves online.
Yeah,
Well, and I like a lot of what you brought up, because that is the kind of crux of the issue, right? Because like I've been kind of like you have on both sides of the coin, but some of my concern comes from instructors who, like, it sounds logical for us to say, oh yes, like it is more ethical not to require students to turn on their cameras because of autonomy and privacy and the choice factor and things like that. But then when you get into like these pragmatic discussions, professors are like, yeah, but I hate teaching the black boxes. So how do I force my students to keep their cameras on? And I make it participation credit. And if you don't have your camera on, if you're not, then I'm taking, and and in a sense, like I've taught like that, right? Where I've taught to black boxes, and yeah, it's not great. It's not fun. But at the same time, I'm kind of like, well, it's not about me, though. Teaching is never about me. But that's my philosophy. So that I think that's where the real struggle and the real ethical dilemma kind of comes in, because it's easy to say, oh yes, this seems to be the most ethical way, but then when you get to the pragmatic aspect of it, I don't know, it seems to kind of fall apart. But I will let Austin speak because I've spoken already.
I thought this would be an apt conversation to use the virtual hand raise after I saw you physically raise your hand. Yeah, I have like quite a bit to say about this topic. I will say first though about what you were saying about teaching the black boxes from a professor's point of view. I think a lot of students would be of the opinion that, well, you're the one getting paid for this and I'm the one paying for this. So if my box needs to be black, it needs to be black. There's certainly a conflict of interest there. That being said, I want to quickly bring up something that happened at the beginning of the podcast. There was mention about words that we should try not to use through the pandemic. A list of the speaker, I think Jesse Strommel was his name, made them sound almost taboo. And one of them was opportunity. And he mentioned that the pandemic, I mean, what it really is at the end of the day, it's an opportunity for death toll. So even though there may be, if there are some like positive learning outcomes that come from this moving forward, let's say we find a way to refine and make good use of V mode, I think it is nice to remember that it doesn't need to be a product of the pandemic for us to make those types of improvements. Even if it is an externality of the pandemic, it's not because of the fact that we had this pandemic. And I think it would be sad to see these things just stop getting refined, because it would be nice if something like this happened again, for these infrastructures to be ready. I think a lot of people that may have been students during the beginning of the pandemic have seen the difference from 20 months ago to today in how well-equipped instructors and platforms are for this kind of thing. But I guess going back to the ethics of it, I have a pretty utilitarian view, and one thing that I think has some positive utility that was left out of the podcast is the fact that I think humans are very much communal creatures, herd creatures. And from the student perspective, one thing that I've always found difficult about online learning, that I actually had an anecdote from today happened in the physical classroom, is that there's something about being in a room with other students and seeing how other students are responding to the lecture you're in. There have been so many virtual classes where I just told myself, this will be recorded. I can rewatch it and take notes then. It's so easy to do. But when you're in a physical classroom and there's like a social thing that happens when you're the only one not taking notes, that you place so much higher level of importance. And maybe it should just be on the student, as an adult learner, to prioritize their own learning. But I think there is some positive utility to learning together, that definition of education that they used in the podcast, building a better communal learning system, that is kind of lost in the online format for a lot of people. And I will, my quick anecdote, and then I'll pass off the mic because I know I talk a lot sometimes. Is that today we had a industry speaker in my fiber optics communications class, and the speaker was in. There were actually a pair of speakers, and they were there via Zoom, but we were all present physically, watching on the projector, and seeing other students like be engaged with this led me to be a lot more engaged. And then when I got to the end of the presentation and we were asked, does anyone have any questions? I had a question that I, had a little trouble forming very eloquently. And I think in a Zoom world, it may have been too easy for me to just leave myself on mute and let it pass. But in a classroom, I felt more motivated to ask a well thought out question, and I got a very thoughtful response that I thought added some value to the conversation, and not just to me, but to the other students there. And I think not seeing those other students taking that variable out of it, that question may have never gotten asked, and it could have led to a worse conversation. So I think the aspect of community was left a little too far out of that podcast, and maybe I'm still a little off of the mark on whether or not it's ethical to have cameras on or off, but I do think it's worth to weigh the utility of the feeling of presence in these learning formats.
Lakeland, you want to go? Go, Lakeland, go. Okay, so
Go, Sterling.
You said several things, Austin, which I was waiting to embellish. The last thing you said was the presence, and you had some other things. So if I can refer to Brand again, this was cultural fault lines in healthcare. He spent a lot of time specifically talking about the art of presence. And basically, and since this is ethics, the manifestation of compassion requires, as a necessary condition, presence. Okay. The source of meaning lies in the face-to-face encounter, not one that is mediated through devices and screens. Face-to-face report in itself is a moral event. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. As genuine presence requires a face-to-face encounter, the intrinsically moral nature of communication becomes evident. So this happened to deal a lot, be kind of focused towards patient care and not having virtual interaction with patients, and to actually, whether it's nursing or the clinician, spending time face-to-face with the patient. That's what this particular book was about, but I think it overflows into our other manifestations of what we're talking about. No?
Yeah, to stick on that, Austin and Sterling, you both mentioned sort of community and the connections there. And yeah, you're right that Stromwell doesn't spend a lot of time talking about community, but he does talk about, the whole podcast is about learning together. And there's this sense in which he's questioning in what ways we can be together in a mediated sense versus a face-to-face sense. And I think that's one of the sort of turning points of this question the university is asking about what platforms we should continue to maintain and what modes of courses are best for students versus best for faculty. A lot of that is about what value is there in being together. And that's a really big question. And I'll share one story from my own work. I'm on the executive committee for an environmental philosophy group. And we've had long conversations for years about whether that conference should just move online for carbon footprint reasons, right? Because right now, once a year, people come from all over the world and they fly to a city and they get a hotel and they do the conference thing, right? But as an environmental organization, we thought we should be on the edge of pushing against that. And yet the pushback for years has been, yeah, but what are you going to lose by doing it online, right? You're going to lose the sort of hallway conversations and the body language reading and the feedback, all the sorts of things, Austin, that you were talking about, and Sterling, that you're referencing, the sort of being together in the physical sense, the embodied being together. And that's one thing that I don't think we've got a lot of really good data on. We've got really good sort of individual level data, like Shelley's sharing about her teaching versus student life. But it's going to be interesting in the next few years to see where education research takes us in the sort of student needs and values and instructor needs and values landscape. Go.
Sorry, because all of this is getting to kind of my question though, because does the outcome outweigh any ethical answer that we have to the question of cameras being on or off? Right? Because if we say, okay, yes, there's empirical evidence to suggest that all of our outcomes are better when cameras are on. Yet at the same time, there's empirical evidence that would suggest that it's maybe unethical to do that, to require or even suggest that students should have their camera on. Does the outcome or the potential outcome outweigh the potential risk that you have of being unethical or unfair? And I think like medically, we would say no, right? Because like I'm thinking human experiment wise, right? Like, and I think that this is a lot of debate when we think about, okay, would we get a lot of better outcomes if we could test things on humans, or if we could like do certain experiments on human beings? And it's like, yes, we could do a lot of things, but we recognize that that's unethical to do those things. So like the outcome doesn't outweigh the moralness or the ethical, I don't know. So that's just something that like is plaguing me, because I am with you all that yes, presence is such a big deal. And I do think there are positive outcomes, but should that outweigh how students feel? Or like, I don't know, Shelley? I don't know if I can pass the mic, but I'm passing the mic to Shelley.
I guess for me, even though I see that difference, I'm not ready to go forward and say it was a causal factor of the improved performance. That I always have teams that perform better and teams that don't, and teams that are more engaged and teams that are less engaged. And yes, generally speaking, the teams that are more engaged perform better. So is the presence a truly visual presence that is causing that better performance? Or is the presence one of they are more engaged no matter what? And evidence of their engagement is their willingness to share visual presence. So I understand what you're saying, trying to figure out the cost benefit on that. I don't know if I'm willing to say that visual presence is what is necessary to be the cause.
I was going to say something that I remember from taking a lot of courses a couple of years ago with Dr. Beaver was when referencing like engagement was like comment posts and how frequently people posted or when they posted, like leaving it to 30 minutes before versus doing it right after something's posted and responding. And I'm wondering if there's maybe a different way of measuring engagement versus just being like a visual cue to see. I know you're specifically talking about like ethically, but I'm just wondering if there's another way of measuring that, or another way of having students more engaged in this virtual setting that would maybe more positively affect like learning. But I have to say, like from a working perspective, for me, working remotely, I guess depends on what kind of work, has been way better, more productive. But learning wise, I've always learned better in person. And a lot of the things that Austin was pointing out is just completely different, like bouncing ideas off of people and the way we like being more confident in talking about certain points or wanting to engage and feeling more, I don't know, I just definitely always learned better and was more engaged when it was in person. But from a working perspective, and also seeing how many students reach out to me where I'm working with the IRB, and I've been working way more with students than I ever did before. Before it was usually the faculty members that only contacted me, but because of being via Zoom, I get students, I would say throughout a week, maybe 6 or 7 that want to set up Zoom calls, where before I would see maybe one a month. So I think there's like benefits to both. I do, with that whole side of equity, I do wonder, there's always going to be some people, when you're wondering about justice and fairness and the ability to have a location or a stable connection. But I think that moving forward, I would say, I don't know if there's a way to just do both. And I know that's kind of unfair to faculty, having like, we're going to have you teach when you might have 5 students there, you might have 200 that are logging in online. But having that option, I know it seems insane, but I think that would be the best way. So you have the students that may not feel as comfortable being able to stay remote, or the people that aren't able to do remote or have a location come in. I don't know. I wonder if there's like a really confusing way to have all of it at once.
Austin's got a hot take about online communication. I saw Dominique's hand up unmute a couple of minutes ago. Jump in, Dominique, if you want to.
Oh yeah, I've actually been taking everything in. Sorry, I'm a little under weather, so if I sound a little off. But yeah, like it brings a lot to. I'm actually taking a course currently at USF for basically it's like a course on teaching, and especially teaching in philosophy. And so, in regards to that, we have been looking at techniques, we've talked about cold calling and all these other things, all these other aspects. And so, it makes me wonder, you think about the students in classes who, sit to the back of the classroom and, they have their hoodies on and they're not paying attention. They have their headphones on. And, it would be great to see, a comparative analysis of, hey, let's take into consideration the participation in class with those students who, are those that automatically want to slouch in the back anyways. And then also those individuals on the screen who are the black boxes. So, or even at that, maybe there needs to be more input in regards to how online teaching can be more effective in regards to stimulating individuals to speak more, other than, like cold calling that you would do in a physical setting. Maybe those other options or opportunities, or even, I know one class I took last year, they have a session in Canvas and things like that where you can, or I think it's, what's it, Canvas? Yeah, something like that, where you can break off into groups, and then students are able to go into their own groups and have their own discussions. And then, the professor could actually peep in on their discussion and interact with them during their discussion. So, I think everything is just so new per se. In regards to the individuals who are utilizing online resources, that we don't necessarily have the techniques that are comparable to the ones that we have in person yet. But when we do have those, I think, you have similar results. It's just maybe a technique and situation.
Yeah, that's well said, Dominique. Thanks. I've been taking notes as we've been talking, and I tend to want to typologize things into value conflicts, because that's like ethics to me. So what I hear is a couple of different sort of conflicting perspectives. One, there's this debate between like cameras on versus asynchronous learning, and there's a relationship there between like maybe asynchronous learning is the best diversity for questions of choice and privacy. Like it gives us the most flexibility as learners, but maybe cameras on gives you the best engagement, right? And so there's a tension there between giving students access to privacy and choice versus putting them in the best position to learn, which might be engagement. And it seems like we can't do both of those things in an online mode. Again, no evidence here, setting up a hypothesis. But then there's also sort of a user's needs or value perspective between, I've seen this between my undergraduates, as Shelley had mentioned, and my graduate students. My graduate students seem to be much more capable and much more interested in asynchronous and online modes. My undergrads seem to need or want synchronous learning. And I hear this from the university too. And then I think, Austin, it was you who said, there's this tension between the responsibility of faculty and the rights of students. Like, we're being paid to teach, and so we should just teach however students want, because students are paying and therefore have rights. And so there's that tension too. And that tension is up against learning outcomes. And again, I'm not a learning outcomes guy here. I don't have any data to share with you about best practices, but I think thinking in terms of those value tensions sort of show us why we have these conversations, why the university and somebody just hasn't said, no, the best way to teach is this mode, right? Because everything ends up in these, as I see them, value tensions between two things that we both hold as good, and we have to adjudicate between them, and the technology hasn't caught up. And Austin, to circle back around to your hot take in the chat, you basically challenged me to stop using online discussion forums because students hate them and they're terrible. And I completely agree. Like, you ask any of my students, Sterling, you're one of them, who've taken my 5627 Theoretical and Applied Ethics course, which has always been a W mode course. And that course is driven by online discussion forums because I want to hear students' perspectives on what they've read, and I want them to talk to one another, but it's asynchronous. And the platform has constrained my approach. Like, if I want those things, the only way to do it is online discussion threads, as I see it. So you're right that I think there's like a weird platform studies or technology-driven issue here where like we're limited by the gear we have in front of us. The same is true of Zoom, right? Like, I can't reach out and slap somebody on Zoom as much as I sometimes want to, or hug, to be fair.
Yeah, to clarify, the break the chain comment was mostly banter, and the previous comment was more of a challenge to those who are in charge of the platform than the educators that make use of it. But to go back to I hate to circle back to this a second time, the presence in the room feeling, and to go back to the podcast, the guest speaker or whoever that was, Jesse Stromwell, on that podcast, talked also about his experience of embodiment in a room and how that's changed throughout his life, after having his daughter, and he can't really take away or hide his embodiment of experience as an LGBT individual in a room. And as I think something that's interesting is with in a cameras off Zoom world, I'm not seeing the same diversity that I see in the classroom. And I think there's some real value, real utility to intersectionality. And especially to someone whose default perspective, like mine, is that of a straight white cis male, I think being in a room where I have to gain practice, being sensitive with my language. Not to say that I'm like necessarily intentionally insensitive in my other circles, but I typically outside of my education are in much more homogenous groups. And I think there's something lost that in this case probably could be retained via cameras on, versus the in-person experience of seeing different faces that look different from yours and hearing voices that sound different from yours and come from a different place. And I do think, though, that engagement is typically lower on the online platform, where you do hear different student voices less often. I think that's probably a shame, but but even just the cameras on versus camera off, I think there's some utility to seeing, like I said, different faces.
Yeah, to extend that a little bit, Austin, like I could see a flip side of that argument too, where there's an advantage to digital modes because I can choose how to present myself in an intentional way, whereas maybe in the classroom I can't as much, right? Through video presentations or choice of background or whatever, like I can present a very distinct image of myself, depending. So there's some affordance to the platform as well as some drawback. And I think this is the sort of conversations we have in around digital ethics issues all the time. And that is, the technology is, well, one theory is at least that the technology is neutral, but its use exacerbates existing issues, right? So if representation and intake of diversity is an issue, digital platforms can make that worse, but they can also help. And it's really depends on how it really depends on the user, whether that works out or not.
Well, to clarify, I think the diversity is still certainly there. I mean, the same students that would be in the physical classroom are there, but your experience of diversity as someone in that Zoom conference versus in that classroom is very different, I think.
But let me pose this side of it too, though, because I can track with you, Austin, for sure, that like being in an online mode, it certainly opens up the door for people to have access to information that perhaps they would not have had otherwise, because maybe you aren't able to go to a face-to-face classroom on XYZ date, but because it's online, you can. And so you're able to enter into this space and people are able to see you and, you know, representation. However, the flip side of that is like, it's one thing to have diversity. It's another thing though to have inclusion, right? And that diversity is getting people there. Inclusion is making them feel like they belong. And that's where I also wonder about, because if we have a diverse group, but we're not making that inclusive because we're requiring cameras to be on, and somebody who is not in an environment that they're proud of might not feel included in that space anymore. They might feel embarrassed or humiliated or whatever. And so the diversity at that point doesn't even matter, because you're not making people feel like they belong there and welcome. And there aren't really safe spaces, but like safe as much as you can be, right, in that space. So I, you know, but I track with you on that though, because I do agree that it does open up that diversity, but I think we're remorse if we don't also include the other aspects, that there is equity and inclusion and in that as well. So I don't know, it's tricky. It is a tricky thing.
Yeah, I think even if you are missing utility, at the end of the day, I think I do land on the cameras off side of that particular question. But if we're talking about the product of education, if the classroom versus the online format, I mean, you know, obviously I would love for a world where, you know, the classroom was the default answer. I don't even know if post-pandemic we'll get back to that, because I do think there is also utility to people that can take classes that couldn't before, and maybe that's just a divergence that needs to just manifest in a divergence of programs. You know, accessibility to programs that can be online or in person is probably a good result, a good positive externality from this bad event, to go back to the grim non-usage of the word opportunity.
It is striking to me to hear a conversation about diversity is important in such a homogenous space as a university classroom. Like you see diversity in bodies in a university classroom because the environment is therefore the same. There's a sense in which diversity is could be expanded in digital platforms, because diversity of environments also takes into account. But again, questions of privacy and access, as Lakeland's brought up. Yeah. Another question we asked, I was just looking at the little write-up we did on the schedule, and the other question we were asking was, you know, what's the relationship, or what's the difference between, or the value difference between attending live versus listening later. We talked about that a little, with the difference between V mode classes and W mode classes, or synchronous and asynchronous learning. So we could chat about that a little bit too. Having taught both of them, as an instructor, I very much prefer V mode courses, because I can see everybody, we can have discussions. I don't fall into Austin's online web discussion post of death phenomenon. I can avoid that largely. But you know, students have to be there, and Shelly has to have her kids around from 6 to 9 p.m. You know, and she doesn't get the choice to do the work whenever she's available, right? Not to pick on you, Shelly, we're all in that same boat, but like, and it's the same deal. Like, I'm teaching 6 to 9. My kids don't go to bed till 8. There's 2 hours where my kids are around, and I have this office door phenomenon that I've got these little latches to keep them out. But you know, they're still knocking regularly, and all of that is, I mean, I should say, since we're recording, all of that is actually lovely, right? That I can actually have parts of my life all together and I don't have to segregate them in the same way. Like I don't have to go to my office to do my work. And Camille, you mentioned this, like the benefits of working from home. Like there's something really important about that sense of togetherness. And if you trusted all your class community in the right ways, and I mean that in like a variety of senses, you might be open to representing yourself as not just a student, but also a parent or a spouse or a pet owner or whatever it is, right? And your life could all be integrated, and that could be part of what it is to learn. But so there's questions of trust here too, but like what hats do you have to take off to put on other hats, which is interesting. I want to ask one question about the podcast, because there were these moments that were weird. There's some like Stommel used like fetishization language pretty regularly, which was a little odd. But then there was this distinct in that same moment in the podcast, he made a distinction between learning and education. And he said, learning is something we do all the time and we do it alone. Well, I think that's what he's implying. And education is something that we do in structured settings together. And I wondered how that resonated with you, because it struck me as a little odd in the sense that, yeah, perhaps education requires educators. And so there's at least one other person involved. And learning requires what? Just environmental cues and motivation? I wasn't really sure what that distinction's like. But if you've got any thoughts there. And Austin, you say, from a student perspective, you think that it must be one or the other, that synchronous lecture watching would be preferred, but the ability to have both has been beneficial. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so like recorded lectures that you're participating in, but can review again later. Yeah. I think that is another benefit. One or the other, yeah.
Well, I think I would first say this was probably not my favorite podcast that we've had so far. I can't say it didn't really resonate with me in the way that some of the others have. I think to your question though about instruction versus learning, I think one puts the onus on a different party. Learning puts the onus on the student, and structure puts the onus on the teacher. And so to separate that, it goes back to my feeling of engagement. The student seeking learning is going to be more engaged no matter what. The student seeking instruction is going to be that passive participant anyhow. And I think I see that more frequently just because we do have an active learning classroom, and I can see very well who really wants to learn. And the student I had on Monday that wanted to challenge me on the tools that I was asking him to use because they had no relevance to him, and he was really just seeking me to tell him how to use it rather than wanting to do the work to learn how to use it. So I don't see how that really changes whether we're in a virtual situation or an in-person situation. There is still that mentality that the student approaches the class with regardless.
Yeah, I hear you, Shelley. Like I've had those experiences in my class too, where it's very clear whether it's in person or online, that there's a subset of students who are there just to take in and not engage, and others who are, either physically cameras on or digitally cameras on, tuned in, asking questions, engaged. And sometimes that's regardless, or that's despite my mode of instruction, right? So whether I'm trying to build active learning opportunities like group engagement, or if I'm just lecturing, the same cues are given by the same students, right? The cues of engagement, the cues of active participation. And so again, maybe this is another example where the question of online learning is just a question of exacerbation of existing difference, right? Students who are actively engaged are going to stay actively engaged, and students who aren't. And all we're doing is making that worse and or better through online platforms.
But I have so many thoughts. Because And I do kind of think that it's important to have this conversation of definition and conceptualization of like education versus learning. And I think it's important to come to some kind of like understanding that learning isn't just what the students do, right? I mean, I think we hear this all the time in leadership and mentoring, like, oh, I can learn just as much from you as I can you from me. But I think that that's even more the case, or should be, or is more the case in a learning environment. But I think that students are so programmed and used to coming in, sitting down, like getting knowledge poured into them that they then have to regurgitate to get the grade, to do the thing, to please the instructor or whatever, that it's not that mutual learning process that like Pablo Freire talks about, you know, and like pedagogy of the oppressed and pedagogy of hope and things like that, that it's that learning and education is more of that two-way dialogic relationship than it is a one-way transactional process. And I tend to agree with that, right? Like, I think, I don't know. So that's kind of a tangent on what was actually being asked. But that's kind of like how I approach the definition of learning and education, is that it is it needs to be constructive. It needs to be the students feeling like they have a role to play in the construction of the course, and in how decisions are made in the course, and in what readings are done in the course, and how you talk about those things. Because otherwise, it kind of just reinforces like a false authority hierarchy in the classroom that is not necessarily always conducive to those learning outcomes that we were talking about earlier. So that's just like one of my thoughts. But
Yeah, those are good thoughts. I keep trying to frame things per my want in terms of values and their conflicts. And I think it's interesting to think about the nature of education as the sort of shifting of the value landscape of students, right? We're trying to onboard students who otherwise might not be engaged through approaches to developing, cultivating engagement in our classrooms, to try to onboard them into the process of learning through education, if we're keeping that distinction. And we're trying to evidence the power of that engagement to students who are already engaged. So there's this like norming in a value sense, a normalizing of what learning is. And that's part of the sort of pedagogical practice despite our disciplines. And agreeing on what that is, especially with platform changes, some of which are forced upon us by the pandemic. I think that's one of the reasons we talk about this in this Be Better Club. It's like we're in these conditions now of potential radical change. And Austin, you've said this, and some other folks brought this up too, but once we step, if and when we step out from behind the shadow of the pandemic, will the changes that have taken place from both the learning and the education perspective hold, or will we fall back to the habits of, you know, privileging and prioritizing face-to-face instruction, and everybody's on campus and doing their thing? And this is not just a question of the university either, but it's a question of what's happening at corporate levels, you know, with employers trying to compel workers to come back to the office after everybody's gotten used to working from home. The same sort of re-normalizing is taking place. Lakeland, you asked in the chat about a comment I made about the bioethics framework, the 4 principles approach. And you asked if there are functionally assessment tools, like are there tools to apply those frameworks? And Camille, you might know better than I do, or as well as I do. It's not really the sorts of, like, understanding how autonomy works is not really the sort of thing you can assess. There are components or approaches to autonomy that are accessible, but the frameworks the authors describe as mid-level norms, right? So it's not the level of case studies and it's not the level of theories, but it's these sort of mid-level strategies for reasoning, or turning points around which we can reason. So they're the principles, normative principles around which we can build arguments. Camille, go ahead.
No, like with the, like, in line to like research, like with consenting and understanding and being your own individual and being seen as an individual. Because I think that's kind of a lot of what Lakeland is saying. It reminds me a lot of that principle when reviewing of autonomy. and when it comes to that camera on and off, I feel like a lot of it has to do with that whole idea of, does that individual feel comfort and the ability to have that choice of the yes or no versus uh, regardless of engagement, really is what I hear you saying, is like, is it fair? And do I have the choice to make that call? And is it fair for someone else to make that choice for me? Because there's definitely Zoom calls where it's made automatic. So the second you log in, your camera's turned on if you have one. So yeah, it's interesting because it's balancing that. And on a researcher or a reviewer side, balancing that with the overall benefit to society, the overall benefit. And I think from an education standpoint, I mean, I'm not an instructor. So I think of it as, if I were to be an instructor, and my job, I would think, would be to balance. I want them to learn the most they can, even though it's based on the individual. If I know that this works, if I've done research and I know that having camera on, they learn better. Is it fair to kind of force or limit that autonomy for the individual so that I know that they're learning and they're, being more engaged? Do I limit the class to only be in persons because I know that that's the best way for them to learn the information? Because I think that if all of a sudden this changes, then all of a sudden no one can use Zoom. Those people that might have that camera off now, the only option is to go in person. I sometimes wonder, if that's the case, are they all of a sudden just not going to come at all? And there are groups that now are only able to come because it's online. So I'm kind of like, it's hard because my dream would never be to go back on campus work-wise, but if I was to go back to classes, I'd want to be in person. So I'm sorry, I don't even know if I answered what you're saying, but that's my thoughts on that.
Well, that's great. Lakeland, go ahead.
Yeah, no, Camille, I love that you brought up that, because that brings up one thing that I was gonna say anyway, and then one thing that you inspired in me. So the thing that I was gonna say anyway was that one of the reasons why I asked Dr. Beaver in the chat about, are there, because I'm familiar with bioethics, but I wasn't sure if there were measurements, because to be completely transparent with all of you, and the reason why this topic I'm kind of passionate about it, is I'm actually doing a research project on this topic right now, where I'm trying to survey students about their perceptions and feelings of fairness and justice in the classroom when these sort of conditions are in place, and what that looks like. So you all have given me just a ton to think about and whatnot. And I think, to Camille, something that you inspired in me, and I think it goes back to all of our discussion so far about whatever empirical tests have been done of outcomes and presence being important or not important, and is this modality or that modality data drivenly better for outcomes. I think one thing that we do have to question, though, is the data collection process, right? Because I don't think it's enough just to say, okay, yeah, here are some surveys that say that teaching in person is better. Okay, but what were the demographics of those who they sampled? Were they all 20-year-old white affluent college students? Because cool, but also that doesn't tell us about a majority of the other kinds of populations and demographics that we have, and that might not hold water in a more diverse or in another type of sample. So even quantitatively, I think we have to be careful about just saying, oh, well, these handful of studies have said that this is good, so it must be the best way to teach, or not the best way to teach, or the most fair, than not most fair. Whatever words I'm trying to say, or the most unfair way to go about it. That's just something I didn't think about that until you were talking about it, Camille, and I don't know what inspired that thought process, but I appreciate you for bringing up what you brought up.
Yeah, that resonates with me too. I remember a research project I did as a postdoc at Purdue. We had a class that was mixed mode. So we had some professional MD, PhD students online and some in the classroom. and we were studying engagement, like using a satisfaction engagement instrument. And we found this really interesting result that students were just as satisfied, just as engaged rather, viewing discussion that was happening live, but not being able to participate as they were actually participating in. And we were like, well, that's a really interesting result. But then we realized exactly your point, Lakeland, that this was a really small sample size of a really particular demographic. And like, we can't do anything with that data necessarily, except to try to replicate the study elsewhere. But it is interesting that, you know, the difference between studying something empirically and asserting something normatively, right? We've asserted normatively, we think, at least in this conversation, I've asserted normatively, that like respecting students' choice in terms of privacy options and the like is normatively important. And we could assess whether students actually believe that, right? So we could assess to what extent are different kinds of privacy important to our undergraduate students. And that would in fact shape how we implement the norm, right? How we implement respect for autonomy is contingent on what that means to our specific context. And so a lot of this, sorry, Camille, go ahead.
No, sorry, I mean, I was like, I'm curious to see if that changes too, that what's considered that sense of autonomy, because I've noticed a shift just from the demographics, certain demographics and ages, and how what someone considers being private versus what's not considered private, or even like a perception of privacy in one area versus not. So it would be interesting to see as times change, if some people wouldn't even consider the need for a camera off as hiding something or being more private. Or they just see it as like, well, it's the norm, everything else is shared, and how that shifts. So it could be something that as we discover it, like, oh, this is something that should be a norm or should be set automatically or an option for people, and then 10 years later, that's not even an issue.
Yeah, well said, Camille. And you've listened graciously to me as I've complained about IP addresses in IRBs, right? Like the idea that IRBs are part of personal information is an open question. I mean, it's just a technological question. Will we get to a point where IP addresses are easily relatable back to a user? Right now, I can set up a VPN and my IP address can come from Brazil in like 3 seconds, right? So IP addresses aren't part of PI now, but they could be in the future. And that's true of genetic information and all sorts of other information, digital footprints and the like, that maybe aren't relevant right now, but will be in the future. And so being open to those changes, which in this case are technologically driven, is important. And our students are like on board with that implicitly, because we have these conversations all the time, but I grew up in the transitional generation where, you know, I didn't have internet and I didn't have a home computer the first part of my life, and then I sort of grew up with it. But my students now are like, they grew up on Twitter and TikTok and whatever their kids are doing these days. You know, it's just a different way of being engaged in the world. And so the way that values work out, given that difference in engagement, is huge. I agree.
Anyway, this kind of goes back to something I believe from Austin's thing with the discussion forum. It wasn't, and it alludes to what you all are trying, you know, talking about, finding studies that would work out to find some answers. And this summer I had to read 3 substantial texts on behavioral economics, and this might be applicable to the discussion format, but also for you, Dr. B, because you know, Camille mentioned that back when we were in class, people wait to the last minute for turning the stuff in, you know, or making a comment. And maybe, I mean, hopefully to satisfy Lakeland, someone in behavioral economics will look into this. But just for one of the studies in the literature that I read, and like I said, it was 3 volumes, I don't remember which one, was deadlines for turning in work. And they studied no deadline whatsoever. The class is free and you can do it whenever you want. You can turn in the deadline just so long as, you know, here's the final week of school before Christmas, blah, blah, blah. And another one had hard set deadlines. And then a third was kind of right in the middle. And although the students felt like the hard set deadline was the most strenuous and they didn't enjoy the class, they're the ones that made the best grade. The ones that were free to use, take their time and procrastinated and actually didn't really turn in a quality product whatsoever. So, however, I mean, that doesn't really relate to what we're talking about. It did kind of touch on several people's comments as far as the study goes.
No, that's really good. Yeah, and I think a lot of us have sort of maybe implicitly, not knowing that literature, developed some of those same strategies just through experience. So you start to see, strategies by which you can encourage your students to become more or less engaged. And that opens up another conversation, right, that we don't have time for this evening, but that's about the space between ethical awareness and ethical manipulation. Because if I think the right thing for my students to do is X, I can use strategies, whether they're behavioral economic strategies or otherwise, to sort of nudge my students to do that. And if I'm right, and that's the best thing for my students, maybe that's okay. But there's another side of that where I think, like, no, that's not okay. Like, there needs to be transparency in our methods as educators. And that's true both of our platform choice too. So, I mean, maybe the best thing to do in the long run is transparent choice, right? And that comes back to the second of Lakeland's topics here, online learning, choice, and equity. Maybe the fairest thing to do is to offer the most choices. And maybe, Austin, maybe I think it was you who suggested, or the V-mode class that's also recorded, so students can participate live, but they can also listen to it asynchronously. I mean, that to me strikes me as the sort of future landscape of virtual learning, where the university might want me to be back in the classroom, but I'll probably be recording lectures, and there'll probably be students who are in my class asynchronously. And I think that blended learning format is probably the future. I think faculty are going to be the sticking point there, because many of us have been habituated into particular ways of teaching, and shifting us out of that is going to feel like a lot of work. All right, friends, I know we're at the end of our time, so if there are any last comments, feel free. I want to thank you again for your time. And Lakeland, thank you for the suggestion for the topic. Our next meeting, now that I've got the dates right, is October 26th. We're going to be talking about AI and autonomous vehicles. And if you've got friends or colleagues who you think might be interested in that conversation, let us know. There's a podcast for that week. They can reach out to me for Zoom details, and I will see you all next time.